I spent many weekends at my grandmother's Victorian house as a child. My parents' demanding work schedules made it necessary, and while I loved my grandmother dearly, her house was something else entirely. Looking back now, as a grown man with decades of hindsight, I still wrestle with what I experienced there. Was it the product of a troubled mind, as insisted by my psychiatrist? Or was it something sinister? The house itself was a relic of another time, tall, imposing, with its faded grey exterior and black wrought iron gates. It loomed over the neighbourhood like a Gothic tower. Inside it was all high ceilings, creaky wooden floors and sprawling rooms. Every bedroom had a fireplace, though none were ever lit in my presence. My troubles began the first night I slept there alone. I was around 13, and while I'd always been prone to vivid dreams, what I experienced in that house went far beyond anything I'd ever imagined. It started innocently enough. I would hear whispers, low, guttural voices that seemed to echo from the walls. Sometimes there were other sounds too, soft grunts like animals shifting in the darkness. Then came the night terrors. I would wake up paralysed in my bed to find two men standing in my room. They were tall, dressed in hunting garb from another century, their figures illuminated faintly by the moonlight streaming through the window. One clutched a musket, the other a blunderbuss. They spoke to each other in hushed tones about the game they were hunting, oblivious to my presence. I didn't dare move. Fear held me in a death grip as I lay there, watching them until they faded into the shadows. Sometimes the room itself would change. The tall mirror in the corner of the bedroom would ignite, flames licking its surface from the inside, though the frame remained untouched. The room would stretch, growing impossibly long, as if I were being pulled into some other dimension. Yet when morning came, everything was as it should be. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. That's what my grandmother said when I finally confided in her. She was gentle, understanding but firm. Old houses make noises, she told me. Your dreams are just a young boy's wild imagination. But her eyes betrayed her. She was hiding something, though I didn't know it at the time. The most terrifying incident happened on a night I will never forget. I had been lying in bed, unable to sleep, as the familiar whispers and grunts started up. Then the fireplace, the one that hadn't worked in decades, suddenly burst into flames. The room was bathed in an orange glow, and for a moment I thought it might actually be warm. But just as quickly as it appeared, the fire vanished, replaced by an inky black shadow that shot toward me. It collided with me on the bed, heavy and suffocating. I screamed, scrambled out of the room, and ran straight to my grandmother's bedroom, tears streaming down my face. She woke and held me as I sobbed, unable to form words. Eventually, she set up a makeshift bed for me on the floor next to hers. The next morning, she asked me to explain what had happened. Her face grew pale as I described the shadow and the fire. Then she told me something I'll never forget. She had dreamed of the exact same thing. She said it was as though she had been watching it all unfold while she slept, right up until the moment I screamed and woke her. She was able to finish off my story like she took the words from my mouth. She looked horrified, realizing what she was dreaming was real. From that night on, she never made me sleep in that room again. Years later, I learned that my grandmother herself had experienced strange things in the house. Other family members, too, had whispered about odd occurrences, though no one ever spoke of it openly. When my grandmother finally moved out, the activity stopped for the most part. I still have the occasional unexplainable experience, doors closing on their own, shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, but nothing like what I endured in that house. As an adult, I've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and major depression. My psychiatrist insists that what I experienced as a child was nothing more than psychosis, a symptom of an unbalanced mind. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was all in my head. But then I think about my grandmother's dream. How could she have known exactly what happened to me if it wasn't real? And why did other family members report similar experiences? Even now I don't have answers. All I know is that there was something deeply wrong with that house, something dark and sinister. Whether it was a figment of my imagination or a genuine haunting, I may never know. But one thing is certain. I will never forget the hunters, the whispers, and the shadow that lurked in the fire. The house on St. Quintin's Avenue in London seemed perfect. My husband, James, and I had been looking for months before we found it. A grand Edwardian home, built in the early 1900s, with its warm brick exterior and intricate woodwork. It had charm, character, and a sense of history that appealed to us both. Even in the cold grey winter of 1974, as the country grappled with blackouts, the house felt inviting. We moved in with our 2-year-old son Robbie, ready to make it our home. The inside of the house was just as enchanting as the outside, with its high ceilings, ornate cornices, and creaking floorboards that seemed to whisper of the lives it had seen. James loved the authenticity, and I couldn't wait to decorate, keeping the Edwardian essence alive. But as much as I tried to focus on its beauty, there was something else, something I couldn't quite name. At night, when James was working his night shifts and Robbie was fast asleep, the house felt different. It started innocently enough. The occasional creak, the odd draft. I told myself it was an old house, settling into the rhythm of us living there. But as the weeks passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't entirely at ease with us. One evening, during a blackout, after settling Robbie in his cot, I curled up in bed with a book by candlelight. The darkness outside was absolute. The only sound, the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. I was engrossed in my novel when a sudden, heavy thudding sound echoed from the staircase. I jolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I thought something had fallen. A box we hadn't unpacked, or maybe a misplaced toy of Robbie's. Holding the candle, I crept out of bed and down the hall, peering over the banister. The staircase stretched into the darkness, nothing out of place. Just the house settling, I whispered to myself, more to calm my nerves than out of any real belief. I went back to bed, but as soon as I lay down, the thudding came again, this time louder. It sounded deliberate, as though someone, or something, was walking heavily down the stairs. I froze, clutching the covers. Eventually the noise stopped, and somehow I managed to drift off. When I told James the next morning, he laughed it off. "It's an old house, Nancy. Probably just the wind or your imagination running wild in the dark." The following night, another blackout plunged the house into darkness. Robbie was sound asleep, and I tried to distract myself with a book. But before long, the now familiar thudding returned. My stomach tightened as I forced myself to investigate again. As I reached the staircase, I stopped dead in my tracks. A whisper. My name. Nancy. I spun around, the candle flickering wildly. There was no one there. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, and I backed away, nearly dropping the candle. My throat was dry, my mind racing. I darted back to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. I lay there trembling as faint creaks echoed outside my door. For the next 2 nights, James was home. The house was quiet, almost mocking me. I told him about the whisper, about the thudding, about the feeling of being watched. He smiled and shook his head. "Nancy, love, you've got a vivid imagination. You're here all day with Robbie, and it's easy to let your mind play tricks on you, especially with the blackouts." I wanted to argue, but he was so confident, so dismissive, that I began to doubt myself. Maybe I was just tired, stressed, and overreacting. The next night, James was back at work, and I was determined to keep my fears at bay. I put Robbie to bed and settled down with my book, but as the lights flickered out once more, I felt that familiar chill. The thudding returned, louder and more insistent. I crept to the top of the stairs, candle shaking in my hand. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but the house felt alive, its shadows writhing like living things. Suddenly, Robbie began to cry. Panic surged through me and I rushed back to the bedroom. As I reached his cot, I saw it, a shadow darting across the wall, long and spindly, moving with impossible speed. My blood turned to ice. That was enough. I grabbed Robbie, wrapped him in a blanket, and bolted from the house, the thudding sound on the stairs behind me as I left. Rain soaked through my nightgown as I banged on the neighbour's door, my heart racing. Mrs. Carter, a kindly older woman, ushered us inside. Between sobs, I told her what had happened, feeling foolish, even as the words spilled out. To my surprise, she didn't laugh. She didn't dismiss me. Instead, she sighed and poured me a cup of tea. "You're not the first to say something like this," she said, her voice low. "The previous tenants left because of strange happenings." My stomach churned. "What kind of happenings?" She hesitated before continuing. "About 10 years ago, an old man lived there. His wife had left him and he hated women, blamed them for all his misfortunes. One night he fell down the stairs and broke his neck. They didn't find him for weeks. I felt both relieved and horrified. It wasn't just my imagination. I wasn't going mad. But the thought of that man, bitter and broken, haunting the stairs where he died made me feel sick. The next morning I packed a bag and took Robbie to stay with my parents. James was skeptical, frustrated even, but he could see the toll it had taken on me. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he agreed we needed to leave. We put the house up for sale within weeks. Before moving again, I insisted on a modern property, one without a history, without the weight of other lives pressing down on it. To this day, I think about that house, about the thudding on the stairs, the whisper of my name, the shadow that darted across the wall. I think about the old man, his twisted bitterness, and wonder if he's still there, waiting for the next tenant to call at home. Alright guys, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.